Hi, welcome to this, our last Sustainable Engineering shot. This particular shot is looking at a case study combining a number of the areas we have discussed. This case study is based on Pickering and how they managed the water defences for the village, which had been flooding for a number of years. So let's look at what we're going to talk about. Well, the background on Pickering Village, how they slowed the passage of water to allow nature to take its course, the recommendations that came out of the project for future development, looking at plantation, beaver dams, weirs and energy production, and a discussion at the end for how you may be able to incorporate these methodologies in your teams and future projects. So let's look at the background of the project. Pickering Village was formed in 270 BC, but it wasn't really developed until 1066 in the Norman Conquest. The area has been regularly flooded throughout its history, approximately every 5 years, and the village itself was designed to deal with these floodings. It managed to deal with these until, unfortunately, 1999 up to 2006, when the village became regularly flooded. In the end, we had 3 consecutive years of flooding, damaging a number of parts of the village. These 3 years of consecutive flooding started to overmine the existing retention schemes, which had been put in place for hundreds of years. A number of shops were damaged, sewage became shredded across the streets, and the riverbanks, which had survived flooding for many centuries, were starting to be eroded drastically. When this was investigated on where this extra flooding had come from, it was identified that it wasn't just a localised event. The flooding was coming from a number of areas throughout the valley and were being channelled at a fixed point as it hit the village. The project team identified a number of areas which needed to be addressed to slow down the passage of water before it came to the choke point within the village. They looked at the peat areas in the upper valley and how these were channelling water. They looked at the forests and how they've been reduced and their rivers cleared, allowing water to passage quickly through them. They'd looked at how the crops in the area had been changed over the centuries and how these crops were no longer sucking in the same amount of water that had happened previously. And they looked at different areas across where water had been sped up throughout the valley and was increasing the amount of volume which was hitting the village at the bottom of the valley. A plan of action was put together on how to deal with this. They would look at peatland restoration, planting new breeds of woodland across the valley, improving the grassland improvement projects, changing arable crops to be more water absorbent, incorporate catchment pits across the valley, plan river restoration projects, increase drainage channels, improve suds around the village, and increase traditional water storage defences. So let's have a look at some of these projects. In the upper valley areas, a number of projects were undertaken to reduce the passage of water. The peatlands were restored, with a number of catchment pits dug within them to keep water centralised within the peatbed areas. Where the woodlands had been destroyed and removed over the centuries, projects were put in place to restore new woodlands where they wouldn't impact on the livelihood of the local farmers. Grassland projects were created to improve the species of plants grown in the areas to reduce the passage of water. More arable crops were planted on the local farmlands in agreement with the local farmers to enable water retention schemes within the local fields. To help slow the passage of water and cope with it locally, the river was developed in certain areas to be able to take larger flows of water passing through them. Local agreements with farmers were set up to allow localised flooding when needed when maximum capacities of 30 and 100-year storms were hitting the valley. This allowed water to be channelled specifically into the set areas where the farmers had agreed that the water could channel onto their lands. This also allowed that the local fields to be regenerated with different types of soils being dropped on them during flooding. Local suds projects using soakaways and permeable paving were introduced throughout the village to help deal with any water which was channelled on the local road network. But also local beaver dams and woodland projects were set up to try and slow the passage of water in the local streams which were feeding into the valley. These were easily imported using local materials, cut down trees which were then felled to drop onto the river street beds, producing the equivalent of beaver dams, building up water pressure behind them and stopping debris washing down into the valley. The works discussed had a great impact on Pickering, reducing the amount of water flow into the area and stopping the flooding in consecutive years afterwards. But a number of areas also were identified within the project which could be incorporated in future works and should be incorporated in future developments in the area. These included a greater use of plantation within the area, with areas such as swells and riverbeds and water catchment pits within the area. These would allow the water to slow down and not be channelled into the rivers and streams, overbursting their banks and their capacity. Also, the incorporation of a greater use of beaver dams, using local materials weaved into the riverbed, allowing that when surges of water came in, they could be held back and slowed down as they pass into the main streams, allowing natural percolation and transportation to happen in the area. They also encouraged the use of weirs in local environments to allow the aeration of water as it passed down into the village. It would also slow down the passage of water, and if built correctly would still allow the flow of fish and different animals to move up and down the streams. Also, a great importance was put on the use of local energy production through the passage of water. Though none was incorporated into the original scheme, it was recommended that any future development works should incorporate energy production within them, be this by large infrastructure developments using the water passage to generate corkscrew energy production, or using more traditional watermill type installations. But they also recommended for surge periods that local generators could be procured to be dropped into the river streams, which could then produce surge power in winter months, or could be developed for use in future projects around the world. So we hope you like this short insight into a case study on how some of the sustainable methodologies we've talked about can be incorporated into a project to reduce water movement in the areas, but also enable you to create more sustainable environments. So we'd like you to have a look at how you could incorporate some of these areas into your future projects, and is there actually an operational requirement to think about the wider impact of the areas we work in and how they impact on our operational bases and infrastructure. We hope you've enjoyed these presentations, and we look forward to seeing you in future presentations in the future.